Thanks very much, Niamh, and welcome everybody. We have a fairly big line out tonight, so I'm not going to waste too much time on the introductions. Just to make the point, it did occur to me, talking to them earlier, Dennis Healy, who was one of those people who should have become Prime Minister and never did, he once made a very interesting comment about his fellow politicians when he accused them of not having a hinterland. They were so obsessed with their jobs, he felt, that they weren't going to make good Prime Ministers. The three speakers tonight are experts in branding and brand development and developing new brands, but they have very interesting hinterlands. In fact, they're kind of quite, they may bend off the rules. One of them has just suggested to me, why don't we swap presentations and see, does anybody notice? I think they probably would. Our first speaker is Nadim Sadek, who has had a very interesting career. He started off as a market researcher. He developed a market research company in London, which became one of the biggest in the world, was bought over by WPP. And if you're bought over by WPP, your first thing you do is you buy an island. He bought one off the west of Ireland, developed his own whiskey, which he still has, went back to London, and now has developed a brand consultancy. Ladies and gentlemen, Nadim Sadek.
Thank you, John. It all comes too quickly, the introduction, doesn't it? And you're on stage and you haven't even gulped yet. Good evening. Thanks very much for all coming along. John has kindly nicked my first chart or two, which were meant to be saying who I was. So I'll do that very quickly. I suppose coming here today, I felt I had in some way to justify my presence, and maybe the single chart gives you a little bit of insight into what I've done in the past, which gives me the privilege of talking to you. I've had three main parts really to what I do. One is in insight, and I worked for three main research agencies in different sizes and different scales around the world. And then I thought I'd better practice what I'd been preaching for so long, and it occurred to me that setting up a brand, creating a brand, should be something that I was capable of doing after giving advice about such things for 20 or more years. So off I sailed, as you heard, into the Atlantic and thought this is a good place to start, and laid plans for doing things. And indeed, the brand of Inistioge, which was based on the island of Inistioge, so that wasn't very hard to do. Didn't research very well as a brand name, but that's fine. It was authentic and its provenance was true. We set about doing things in 6 different categories. I think, given that we're here with Bord Bia, the fact that we did food, we did a range of smoked fish and a number of pork products was interesting. And we also did whiskey. The whiskey lives on, the pork and fish have perished, I'm afraid. But it was a fantastic period. It probably took about 10 years, really, for the whole thing to be birthed. Thinking through what we would do, thinking what order we would do things in. We created our own music as well. We had artists who came and were resident on the island and created things. And gradually we built up a whole kind of infrastructure and landscape for the brand into which we could launch this kind of premium Irish single malt whiskey, which is what our kind of hero product was. And that lives on, though in slightly fallow fields at the moment. And having done that, I felt that I'd spent more than 20 years really understanding how brands work and helping people to know, when communication might be appropriate or when innovation might be, or a change in production, or that there might be, something else at play, and that was often logistics or distribution or so on. I thought, having understood all that and then actually put my own money and my own energy into creating a brand and seeing how difficult it can be and understanding the various pressures, people are saying, well, why don't you have more numbers on Twitter? In the meantime, you're trying to get the fish out of the sea, or to get them to a supermarket without them going off in a chilled container somewhere. That I thought, actually, what I wanted to do, if I did anything again, would be to work helping people with that knowledge of creating a brand and the sympathy that comes from operationally and intellectually and financially being invested in a brand, bring that sympathy, bring that empathy to play in developing marketing services again. So that's how I've ended up back at the kind of coal face, if you like, creating brands with people and helping to monitor and manage them, which is what Transgressive X does. So that's how I come to this party. And the thing that has really always been very apparent to me is that commodities make money. Brands tend to make more money from those commodities. So people build brands. The process of building brands can take you in many different directions. You know, if you look at the framework, you know, one of the things that I often do when I look at a marketplace is just, you know, plot things and say, you know, there's cheap, there's expensive. You know, where does this one sit? You know, the beginning of positioning. What sort of price point are you going to get to? Because essentially, I think what brands tend to do is say, we'll make something desirable for you and we'll offer it at a price. And if we're lucky, as a consumer, you'll give us your time, your attention. If we're even luckier, you'll transact with us and we might get some money off you. And finally, and there's some debate about whether this is just a myth, really, but we might end up with you being an advocate for the brand and being loyal to it. I was told last week that I was being very old-fashioned when I was saying that, you know, there is advocacy and there is loyalty. And I was told by this very clever planner in a London advertising agency that who is very clever and who is very nice, because she might listen to this and think I'm being sarcastic, but I'm not. She said, 50% of your 20% most important consumers are lost to you each year. And that kind of amazed me, because I thought, you know, once you got to advocacy and loyalty, you're kind of embedded in there, and it'd take a skyscraper falling down on you to kind of change it. But she said, actually, they move very quickly. So anyway, as a brand, you create desirability and you put it out at a price you think can be afforded by the consumer. If you're lucky, as I was saying, they give you their attention, they then transact with you, and they end up in long-term loyalty. The ways that you go about engineering and ensuring that that relationship exists are many. And I'm mindful of the fact that this conference that you've come to is entitled Meaningful Marketing. And I think it's deliberately, you know, meant to be saying there are values of sustainability, there's integrity, there's all those sorts of things. And the next two speakers will talk about these far more virtuous things than I will, much more fully, I'm sure. What I think about is that rather than the kind of moral, ethical, kind of high-minded things that are there are also the realities of needing to keep consumers basically engaged in a meaningful relationship with you. And that's quite difficult. You know, when you're building a brand particularly, or when you're trying to expand it, all the time there's pressure with the brand to operate it, to make it profitable, to have it as a good business, and meanwhile to interact in a meaningful way with consumers. And what I've tried to do is to develop a way of looking at things which boils down to a very simple insight. And that simple insight is that a brand which interacts more positively at more points in the consumer journey than its competitors tends to win in the category that it's operating in. It is pretty well that simple. If you can connect with people, and there are many different words to be used in connection and to be involved with and to have a relationship with and so on, and I'll be going through a lot of those different things. But basically, if you can get a brand to interact more positively, more often at more places, and that's across the whole consumer journey, from acquisition to transaction to retention, if you want to use old-fashioned language, then that brand tends to win. And it was the thinking that got me to that place that I thought I would tell you about. My hope being that the legacy of my chat with you this evening is that you can see, whether you ever do anything like this again or not, or whether you kind of want to get deeply involved in it, there is, as a legacy from this talk, a framework which says you can think about running a brand, measuring it, managing it, and monitoring it along this kind of simple, actionable framework. So the thinking that got me here was, look at all these things that are up on the screen. You know, there are hundreds of ways of looking at brands, whether they're brand equity studies or pricing research or, you know, secret shoppers, whatever. And actually, companies I've worked for and managed and have done all of these things. So I've had hands-on experience of all these things. There are many companies. I mean, this is a handful of logos that tell you who's around. They're wonderful, good companies run by bright people doing lots of kind of intellectual innovation. Meanwhile, this, it's meant to look horrific and you're not really meant to be able to understand it. But what it is a chart produced by the Boston Consulting Group this year, which talks about the purchase journey and touch points in the FMCG category in the States this year. And it goes from the left-hand side from discovery, so that this is kind of shopper or consumer journey, to search, to locate, to buy, to purchase. To post-purchase, so that's kind of relationship going on. You can see it's just incredibly hard to manage each of those things. And if you're doing it in a different way and worried about it and not kind of having a big picture of it in your mind all the time, it can really flummox you. And meanwhile, thanks to Google, we have the 0 moment of truth slide, which was produced a couple of years ago, which I think is really helpful, because it says that, you create a stimulus for people to consider a brand, and then good luck. You can't really control them. The consumer these days goes off and searches in lots of different ways themselves. They talk to their mates, they look at videos, they ask their whole network of people what they're about, and finally they get to a shelf. And trying to tag them along the way is incredibly difficult, much more complex than it used to be, and they can pop around like pinball machine balls. So the challenge to me seemed to be to find a way that was simple and actionable and consistent for developing these more meaningful relationships across a whole swathe of touch points, across the whole consumer journey, for brand owners to manage their brands with. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about. I call it brand exchange power. Other people are calling it different things. Some of our clients are, for example, calling it brand love power. And it is really the interrogation of and the understanding of how that brand can have more positive interactions at more points in the journey than its competitors with consumers. The sort of highest level understanding of it is, I think, most brands work by what we call seduction and persuasion. You can probably look at each other and think, are you a seducer or a persuader? Once you let this settle, which probably isn't sitting here right now doing it, but you can actually decide whether you're principally a seducer or principally a persuader, and you can see who you're attracted to and who you're unattracted by, and begin to kind of work out all sorts of things. There are some HR departments that have asked us whether we could adopt the framework for building brands to help them evaluate their HR assets, as they call them. So here we are. There's your brand, the pink bit, and it's deliberately like a kind of magnet, like a horseshoe magnet. And it's got its powers of seduction and its powers of persuasion. And there are some brands which you'll very quickly think of as being chiefly seducers. Apple used to be. It's tried a lot to be much more of a persuader, and it succeeded. I mean, if you look around up there, it's all, well, I suppose that's a creative kind of suite of kit up at the top, but it's all Apple. You look around most offices, you see Apples now in the way that PCs completely dominated before. So they've managed to get much more persuasion into themselves. On the other hand, a brand like Ryanair, which we all know was crushingly persuasive and really didn't bother much about seduction at all, has in the last year or so tried to make itself much more seductive. I'm currently finding that it's become a bit messy and it's much harder to figure out whether I should fly with Ryanair these days than it used to be. But you also get brands that started off in persuasion, have given themselves more seduction, they kind of drift to somewhere else. There is no real answer. There is no perfect answer. A brand doesn't have to be seductive or persuasive or to be the most of anything. It's understanding the balance of those things in the category in which you operate so that you've got a competitive point of difference from those that you are up against. So how do we look at seduction and persuasion, making it slightly more kind of molecular? We did a lot of work on social exchange theory, which was popular in the 1960s. We looked at neuropsychology, we looked at System 1 and System 2 thinking, a whole pile of stuff which we knew we had to get our hands around. And we looked at trackers and all sorts of things that people were using to try to manage and measure their brands. And it came down to us understanding that we had what we call 8 lenses. There are 4 of seduction and 4 of persuasion. I'm going to take you through these in a bit more detail in a minute, so I won't linger on them just now. But just to show you that there are those 8, and it is by means of these 8 lenses, which we kind of think of as the vital signs of a brand, that we have found we can help people to achieve that holy grail, as we defined it at least, of having more positive interactions at more points along the consumer journey. When you think about seduction, it's quite interesting. You can do all sorts of kind of meta-analysis. You can keep it simple. You can start thinking a bit more about it. Let me just do this briefly. If you think of seduction essentially causing want or leading to desire for the brand, that can happen at a number of different levels. You can have personal desirability. I really want that thing. It's a pair of trainers that I really fancy because they suit my feet and it's all about my running. That's what I want. You can have social kudos arising from it. So not that I, or perhaps anybody in this room, I don't know, is an advocate of the brand Virtue, but you probably all know it to be an extremely high-end, expensive mobile phone. They're about 10 grand a piece or something the last time I looked. You can have a brand that brings great social value. So when you're with your peer group, they think, crikey, you've got a Virtue, and you get a lot of kudos from that. And then on the other side, you can have something which is societally virtuous as well. And perhaps, I guess that Anders might be talking a bit about that with his brand, that it brings some of the values that I think were the headlines for this getting together of meaningful marketing. It's somehow a higher order, purpose and values driven thing. Equally, persuasion does this kind of meta-analysis, and you can look at things situationally. Is it physically and emotionally easy for me to interrogate your brand and get on with it? And is it functionally possible for me to use it? Does it have a point of difference that's kind of relevant to me? And can I get to it easily enough? So all of that bulks up into this. This is the most complicated chart there's going to be. It gets easier from here, but it's a good enough little summary, because you've got brand exchange power at the top, made up of seduction and persuasion, and then you've got your kind of 8 vital signs of health across there. And these are just magnifiers. So if you think about, just for fun for a second, if you come to vitality here, and if you're looking at a category and you said, well, what do I do with all these things that you put up? How do I think about it? If you think about carbonated soft drinks for a minute, I'll be talking about Coke again later on, but think about Coke, Pepsi, and let's say Red Bull. And if we were looking at the category and thinking, well, how are they operating on these vital signs? You'd come along and you'd say, does Coke have vitality? Probably. Does Pepsi have some? You might say, it doesn't feel like quite as much. And then you say, Red Bull, does that have vitality? And you'd say, yeah. And then you're kind of thinking, well, which has got more, Coke or Red Bull? We know Pepsi's gone off a bit. So you kind of go through your magnifiers and you see that all 3 brands have got popularity, but Coke and Pepsi are probably more popular than Red Bull. But it's on the thing of momentum that Red Bull really kills it. Red Bull is full of momentum. Coke's not bad on momentum. The problem that we have with our perceptions of Pepsi is that it has no momentum going for it. So these different ways of looking through different categories are the ones that allow us to understand what the competitive landscape is and how we can manage our own assets amongst that. And then the final bit of the theory, before I show you some examples, is that if you think of the consumer journey as being, you want people to kind of wake up and think about your brand and go exploring it. They might try it and buy it, have a kind of new experience with it, and finally end up in a relationship with it. Their sense of enjoying their relationship with your brand should be increasing the whole way along. So we should be looking at brand exchange power rising. And a brand's purpose, again, I reckon Ella's Kitchen will have something to say about this, is often internally defined, and it's actually getting it out there. It's all very well knowing exactly what you want to do, but getting people to perceive what you're trying to communicate and to comprehend it and accept it and assimilate it is often a very difficult thing. So this whole way of thinking about brands, that framework that I had a minute ago, is applied at each of these points, so that you can see how different brands are relating to each other and how effectively your purpose is being communicated. So that is the theory done. How does that actually get employed? What I'd say to you is you could take that great big chart with all the colors and all the facets and lenses on it and apply it to any category and just sit there and work things out and see the shapes of the different brands. Here's just a bit of I suppose, drive-by analysis, because this hasn't been done in the kind of proper and full system. But if you look at something like Diageo, who said, whiskey, something I know a little bit about, struggles to really pick up anybody below 35. They really always feel like they're too immature, they don't know how to discriminate between them, they haven't learned the language, they don't know how to drink the stuff, and it's really hard. So they go and do actually pretty obvious stuff. Some of this is very simple and straightforward. They want to make whiskey more desirable. So what do? They go for aspiration. David Beckham, celebrity endorsement. It's hardly groundbreaking, but it's effective. And then you get associations of glamour and success. And you bring in something which is a bit different to say, this isn't just your normal whiskey. We're signaling physically. We're breaking the category norms, and we're bringing contemporary visual cues. So on desirability, you've seen that it's been built up through aspiration and attraction just from those 2 strands. On vitality, that I spoke about it a minute ago. At the top level, vitality is full of, an energetic lifestyle that people find kind of aspirational. And then the notion of giving wings and ideas to people and engaging brand zealots brings the popularity and the sense of people always talking about it forward and creating a huge buzz with mass audiences. I mean, it's hard to look anywhere without seeing something sponsored by Red Bull. And if you're not watching sport, then you're seeing those minis and other craft going around the roads with the great big cans sticking out the back. There's always something going on with Red Bull. So momentum is something that I think that brand uses exceptionally well. Heinz is an interesting one because it's been around so long, hasn't it? I mean, and it's still relevant. It's still contemporary somehow. It's the fabric of family life, and we've known it forever. There are two things which work really well for it. One is this kind of empathy, and there's a little, I don't know where we got this from, probably Twitter, or no, it looks more like Facebook, but whenever I was ill, especially with a sore throat, my mum would make me some Heinz cream of tomato soup with buttered toast soldiers. It fixed me right up. Good old mums, eh? Actually looks a little bit like it was planted, doesn't it? It's a bit too direct, but anyway. That's about the brand showing empathy with the consumer. And then, down here, the relate to it way of thinking means that the brand that does things which you look at and say, actually, I like the way you're handling your insight. You understood me, but now I like what you're doing with it, which is that it says, get well soon, Skyver. There's a cheekiness, there's an understanding, there's a real straightforwardness about the relationship. And then the final one of these seduction lenses is honesty. And I had to do a quick substitution from my normal side here, which is Google, because this is a negative one. You probably remember, it might have been a year or even 2 years ago, but Starbucks in the UK, I think in Ireland as well, failed to pay its tax or failed to do something that was very transparent anyway. The lack of transparency led to a 7% increase in latte sales at Costa for about 6 weeks after that news broke. It was a really direct lack of transparency problem. So I haven't tagged it as lack of integrity because, interestingly, the brand maintains its integrity of supply, the whole supply chain and so on. It's a good story that didn't really get damaged, but the revelation of corporate tax avoidance did lead to a problem. So just coming on to the last four then, McDonald's, the world's greatest food restaurant, #1 fast food restaurant, really gets to where it is through clarity, it seems to us. You know exactly what you're getting from it, which is purpose. And a lot of brands struggle with purpose. If people don't know exactly what you're on about, then they struggle ever to relate to you properly and they pop in and out of a relationship. It's almost the most important thing we've found. I mean, we try to keep all of these 8 things at pretty much the same weighting. But if there's one that I would have to pursue at the start if I was building a brand, it'd be purpose. What are you here to do? What do you offer me? And then deliver that with incredible consistency. And that's a neat little poster at the bottom, isn't it? 200 meters and then 197 meters. It's cheeky again. It's just saying, we're getting you there. You can be with us soon. Uniqueness, you might remember Ben & Jerry's when before it was bought by Unilever. Not that it has suffered from that, of course. I like Unilever very much. But it was an American brand that started from very modest means and became something enormous. But it had really progressive, countercultural flavors and lots of fun, which were promoted by its creators. And they humorously customized lots of things along the way. So they had a point of difference and a real relevance to that. You probably can't see it here, but this is a picture of Obama. And it says, yes, pecan. You might remember, yes, we can. So, it was a bit of a play on that. It was topical and cheeky and clever. Accessibility. Coke, what does Coke do? I thought when I was looking at these that I should probably put Coke in seduction because it plays that game so well. But actually, if you think about its remorseless march through our bladders worldwide, the brand focuses on generating need. You need to have this, a desire for a drink, while its bottlers and its licensees create availability and distribution to solve that need immediately. It's just an incredibly clear accessibility strategy. And finally, Lidl. Nobody wants to talk about Lidl, but Lidl's doing so well. It's the European retailer brand really at the moment. And what it's doing is saying product performance, which is that the stuff is good enough and it's cheap enough, and it comes in at a price point which is appropriate, is actually beating the offers of all those other added value retailers. And so everybody's struggling in between. The top's okay, the bottom's doing well in the bits in the middle. So Tesco and Sainsbury's in the UK are obviously struggling with this sort of thing. The purpose of doing this, I hope you've seen, and I'm just about to finish, is just to say that if you take these vital signs and apply them across the whole category, and I'm happy to take questions or to answer you personally afterwards and to chat about brands in any way you want, you can actually understand an entire category and see where there's a competitive bunching up where you're all on momentum or something, or where everybody's there with going to put a value for money. And you can say, well, how can we make more noise on that one? You probably can't. So you then look around the other of the 16 facets and you say, actually, we'd go for these 2 or 3 and that'll differentiate us. It's true to our own purpose. It's what we believe in and we can pursue it. So finally, the whole point is that if you manage your seduction and persuasion, you will ensure that positive interaction across brands, and I think across all those consumer interactions. And I think when you're sitting there with a whole business to run, of which a brand is part, it can be daunting. And having a simple, actionable framework that allows you to understand the whole consumer journey is something that I've found incredibly useful to develop. And I hope that in sharing it with you, you find some value in it too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.